It is FI Regulation Festival that's even more than every single road crossing. This is to alert cars and pedestrians of the fact that we are a moving train, and we do have the right of way through all road crossings. Now, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with Morse code, that's even the Morse does stand for the letter Q. Back in the day, this used to mean that the Queen had the right of way. However, now it is used for railroads around the nation. Now, coming up here on the downhill side of the train, folks, we are going to pass by the old Colorado and Southern Freight Depot. The Freight Depot has recently been renovated and now serves the city of Leadville as a local event center hosting weddings and other parties. And they also have some smaller little honeymoon cabins that you are welcome to rent out. Now, to the right of the Freight Depot here on the downhill side of the train, that we will also pass by a tall 3-story brick building. This old brick building that we will pass by here on the downhill side of the train was in fact the original hospital building for Leadville, Colorado. It was built in 1901 by the Sisters of Charity, and it was used as Leadville's primary hospital until the new one was built in 1957. Now that building serves as condominiums, and some of the people who stay there do say that old spirits still haunt the halls. Now, historically, Leadville, Colorado was in fact founded upon the mining industry. In fact, it would be all the way back in the winter of 1859 and 1860 that miners on the Front Range of Colorado heard rumors of placer gold in the sand and riverbeds of the Arkansas River Valley here. And it would be in March of 1860 that a group of miners would travel into this area here to test out those rumors. These miners were led by a man by the name of Abe Lee. Now, legend has it that Abe Lee dug his gold pan into the riverbed, and when he pulled it out, he saw gold, and lots of it. He was very excited, letting out a great shout. He would exclaim, "I have all of California in this pan," as this was after the California Gold Rush. And shortly thereafter, miners would flock to the newly named California Gulch. Less than a year later, that mining encampment up in California Gulch would grow very extensively, and they decided to incorporate it and call it a city. And so they would call it Oro City. Now, oro is the Spanish word for gold, and the mining done in Oro City was all done in the riverbeds. The miners would use gold pans and sluice boxes to sift through the riverbeds themselves in the hopes of striking it rich on gold. And many miners did. Now, unfortunately, the gold rush that took place there would be somewhat short-lived, and this was due to a troublesome black sand that lay in the riverbeds. This black sand would clog up the miners' sluice boxes. It was very plentiful, very sticky stuff, and these miners were quite frustrated with this black sand. Ultimately, it would force most of the miners out of this area, as it was simply unprofitable for them to be dealing with that sand on a daily basis. But in 1868, this area would become a ghost town. Now, that would not be the end of Leadville's origin story, as miners would return to this area back in 1874, and I'll be sure to give you all more on that here in just a moment. But first, coming up on the downhill side of the train, we are going to pass by our rail yard and our roundhouse. Here at the rail yard, you will all get the chance to see some of our extra train cars, the different equipment we use to maintain our rail line, and you will even see 2 of our other locomotives. Our roundhouse is a maroon-colored building. You will see it shortly here on the downhill side of the train. That is where we do house our engines in the winter time. And we also do a lot of shop work on our engines, our train cars, things like that in the roundhouse there. It is a 3-stalled roundhouse, meaning it could house 3 locomotives. Now, out there in front of the roundhouse today, you will be able to see 2 of our other engines. Right in front of the roundhouse, you will have engine 1714. Engine 1714 does have another name, and we like to refer to her as good old Pride and Joy. Pride and Joy has served this rail line as our primary unit on this rail line for 28 out of our 34 years of operation. And that is why we like to call her Pride and Joy. Now, the engine that is pushing us up the mountain today is typically our backup unit, but we are using her as our primary this year. And she is known as engine 1918, aka Tough and Ready. Engine 1714 and 1918 are both original engines here on this rail line, as we did purchase these 2 engines in 1987 with this full rail line. It does look like they have engine 1714 running here today to do a bit of a switching operation. on 1714 here, you can see engine 1889. She is a darker colored scheme engine with a white logo on the side there. Engine 1889 is actually new to us here on the Leadville, Colorado and Southern Railroad. We purchased her just last year in September of 2021 from the Alamosa Railroad. Now, being that we are a landlocked railroad up here, it was quite an interesting process shipping that locomotive up here to our track, but we did so on an extremely large truck. This truck was in fact over 200 feet long. And we would offload that engine right here on these very tracks with a set of two very large cranes. All three of our engines are modified GP9 diesel electric engines. They were all built in the mid to late 1950s by the Electromotive Division of General Motors. Each engine has a top running speed of 66 miles an hour, and each individual locomotive weighs approximately 120 tons. Now, as you heard me say before, folks, after the miners would leave the gold rush here in Leadville, it would be a few years, but miners would actually return to this area. In fact, there were two men in particular. These two men were educated with master's degrees in geology, and they actually had a hunch as to what the troublesome black sand in the riverbeds might be. So they took a sample of that troublesome black sand down to an assay office in Alma, Colorado. And it was discovered that that troublesome sand was in fact a mineral known as sericite. Sericite is the carbonate of lead, which is how Leadville did receive its name. And not only that, but it is also the base for silver ore. It is essentially how they knew that there was silver in the hills up here. Well, when this was discovered, Leadville would blow up. In fact, after silver was discovered in Leadville, we would become one of the largest mining towns west of the Mississippi River. Back in its heyday, the upper Arkansas River Valley here could have been home to as many as 80,000 people living in the surrounding area, with as many as 40 to 50,000 within city limits. Not only that, but Leadville was also a hub for the newly invented narrow gauge railroad companies, which were expanding their railroading empires into the Rockies, trying to tap into the riches that existed there. Now, the current section of track that we are traveling over, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the more level sections on our train ride today. Later in our journey today, we will hit grades as steep as 3%, and our average speed will be approximately 10 miles an hour. Now, you might think that is sort of a slow speed for a train to travel at, but we do think it is the perfect speed for the many photo taking and very possible wildlife viewing opportunities you will have from today's train. Furthermore, if I see any wildlife from our train today, I will do the best that I can to point those animals out to all of you. section of tracks that we are traveling over here, folks, is a very long straightaway. In fact, the longest straight stretch of tracks on our entire train night. This stretch of tracks here is known as the power line tangent. Here across the power line tangent, if you look closely at the forest floor, you might notice many large holes that are dug into the ground interspersed throughout the forest here. These holes that you might see in this area are known as prospect holes. Prospect holes back in the day were a method that miners would use to essentially survey the land in the hopes of buying it for a mining claim. They would dig very large holes into the ground and take a sample of that base layer of dirt to an assayer. The assayer would then determine the worth of that land, and if he wanted, he could purchase a mining claim and mine upon it. As I said before, after silver was discovered here in Leadville, folks, we became a very popular boom town. In fact, back in its heyday, Leadville was home to almost 80,000 people, and in 1879, Leadville had 19 hotels, 41 lodging houses, 38 restaurants, 82 saloons, 6 livery houses and stables, 12 blacksmith shops, 7 smelters and reduction works, 2 assay offices, 28 churches, and of course the housing to accommodate the 50 to 80,000 people that lived in the upper Arkansas River Valley here. Leadville was even considered to become the state capital of Colorado. In fact, Leadville was founded in 1875 before Colorado was even a state yet. Colorado would be ratified into the United States back in 1876. To become a state, they obviously had to select one of their cities to utilize as a state capital. So they took the 5 largest cities at the time and they put them on a list and took a vote. These cities included Denver, Central City, Golden, Cripple Creek, and of course, the city of Leadville. Now, as we all know, Denver would win the title for state capital as they do serve as our state capital here today. However, Leadville missed out on being the state capital by just 2 votes. Now, down there in Denver, they do think they're pretty cool and they like to refer to themselves as the Mile High City. But up here in Leadville, we think that's just a little bit lame. We like to refer to those Denver residents as lowlanders. We do like to gloat just a little bit, and we do refer to ourselves as the 2 Mile High City, of course. As Leadville sits at 10,152 feet at our city center, with the east side of town getting as high as 10,500 feet above sea level. Leadville, Colorado is in fact the highest incorporated city in all of North America, and Leadville does boast the nation's highest post office, golf course, airport, and right now you are riding the nation's highest standard gauge railroad. Today, ladies and gentlemen, about 15 to 30 feet off the side of the tracks on the downhill side of the train, running along the forest floor and sometimes up in the trees, you will notice a small copper wire. This wire that you might occasionally notice on the downhill side of the train is actually the old telegraph wire, used for communication between Leadville and Climax Mine via Morse code back in the day. Now, I will tell you all that there are a remaining 10 telegraph poles between right here and where we stop our train ride today. It's kind of a fun little scavenger hunt to see if you can find all 10 of our remaining telegraph poles. Again, these poles will all be on the downhill side of the train. And they will be no further from our tracks than 50 feet or so. Now, coming up across the next half mile or so, folks, we are going to start seeing a lot of aspen trees. Aspen trees are very easily identified by their white bark and the black features that exist on their trunks. The aspen tree is one of Colorado's more iconic tree species, as they do turn a very beautiful golden color during the month of September up here. Now, these circular features that you see on the trunks of the aspen trees are something known as a bowl. These bowls look a little bit like an eyeball on the tree staring back at you, and the bowls on the aspen trees are created when these trees will drop off their lower branches as a defense against wildfires. Aspen trees, ladies and gentlemen, are actually very unique organisms because these trees propagate by their root system. This means that one grove of aspens is entirely connected by its roots, and that makes it a single living organism. Aspen groves can be some of the largest living organisms on planet Earth, and the largest aspen grove sits in Utah, taking up 96 acres of land. That being that each and every aspen grove is a single living thing, each and every aspen grove, of course, has its own unique DNA. This DNA will decide things for these trees, like when they will grow their leaves in the spring, what shade of green they will be in the summer, and what shade of orange or yellow they will turn in the fall. Now, another intriguing fact about the aspen trees here is that these trees are actually closely related to the willow tree. That being the case, they produce something called celiac in their bark. Celiac is one of the primary ingredients in painkillers such as aspirin. Now, what's unique about this, ladies and gentlemen, is that biologists here in the state of Colorado have actually observed cow elk eating the bark of an aspen tree just before giving birth to their newborn elk calves. Now, right here, ladies and gentlemen, we are passing through one of the largest aspen groves on our entire train ride today. As we do, be sure to keep in mind that we are passing through a single living being at this point, as these trees are entirely connected on both sides of the track here. Aspen groves are also known as aspen clones, and that is because every single tree in one single aspen grove is genetically identical to the tree next to it. Now, as we do enter the clearing here on the downhill side of the train, ladies and gentlemen, take a look back towards the left there. You will get another fantastic shot of Mount Massive out there in all of her glory. Mount Massive is so named because it actually has more surface area, over 14,000 feet, than any other mountain in the lower 48 states, making her truly impressive. But coming up here, folks, we are going to enter into an avalanche debris field. As we enter into this avalanche field, be sure to check out both the downhill and the uphill sides of the train, and you will get an idea for the destructive force of an avalanche. All the trees and debris that you see littering the hillside beneath us down there used to be a standing forest way up there above us. As you can see, avalanches are quite destructive forces of nature. In fact, an avalanche can move downhill at speeds of up to 80 miles an hour, clearing out just about everything in their path. That avalanche and all of the avalanches that we will pass through on today's train ride did take place in March of 2019, as we did have a record-breaking winter that year. Now, being at these high altitudes up here in Leadville, Colorado, winter is certainly a fact of life for us up here. In fact, being at such a high elevation, we have the chance of seeing snowfall 365 days out of the year. My best examples of this would be that 2 years ago in 2020, we came up the track bed here on the summer solstice. On June 21st and June 22nd, the summer solstice, we got a winter snowstorm, and we received 12 inches of snow. I've even seen it snow up here on our train ride on the 4th of July, which is always a good time. Now, along our train rides, a lot of folks do ask me what different species of wildlife we're able to see here from the train. And we do actually get the chance to see many of Colorado's beautiful big and small wildlife species. Almost every single day we do tend to see a couple of mule deer, so be sure to keep a sharp eye and you will probably see a deer or two from our train today. However, on more of an occasion, we do get the chance to see black bears, elk, and moose. You see some smaller game animals such as picas, marmots, squirrels, ground squirrels, pine monkeys, porcupines, weasels, and the occasional fox or coyote. And a couple of years ago now, we actually did have a very rare sighting of a mountain lion right here from the track bed. If you do get the chance to see a mountain lion in your lifetime, you should consider yourself very fortunate, as these animals are extremely elusive, and they do take hold of some of the largest territories in the lower 48 states of any mammal. Colorado is said to have a robust mountain lion population with anywhere from 3,000 to 7,000 of these big cats in the state here. Now there is a little saying about the mountain lions here in the state of Colorado, folks. That saying goes, if you spend a lot of your time hiking in the backcountry of Colorado here, while you probably will never see the mountain lion has most certainly seen you, as they are very curious animals and do like to know who is passing through their territory at any given time. Now, we do also get the chance to see black bears here from the track bed. Typically, the best time of year to see a black bear from our train ride is in the month of August. The reason for that is we get a lot of wild raspberries that grow along the track bed here during the month of August, and it draws the bears to the area. Now, a lot of people do seem to believe that we have grizzly bears here in the state of Colorado, but we actually do not. Grizzly bears were all hunted to extinction back in the 20th century here, with the last sighting taking place in 1976. I think a lot of folks get confused about grizzly bears due to the color of our black bears. The name black bear is a little bit misleading, as these animals actually do come in several different color variations, depending upon their genetics. Black bears are not only black, but they can also be a cinnamon reddish color, brown, and there are even blonde or white black bears roaming the hills of North America. Now, we do also get the chance to see the moose here from the train ride. It was actually back in 2017 that we had our first ever moose sighting, but since then we've seen several moose every single year. I will say we have had a young bull moose hanging out around our track bed in the past couple of weeks, so be sure to keep a sharp eye out for him. Moose were actually reintroduced into the state of Colorado back in 1978 and 1979. Over the course of those 2 years, 36 different moose were released. Since then, moose populations have done quite well for themselves, and nowadays we have around 3,000 head of moose in the state of Colorado. Now, actually, if you look on the downhill side of the train down there, ladies and gentlemen, on the valley floor, that is something called a riparian ecosystem. And that is a moose's favorite habitat. Moose love to hang out in that riparian type ecosystem down there, as they are actually semi-aquatic mammals. A little known fact about the moose is that these animals are actually fantastic swimmers. Moose can dive up to 25 feet below the surface of a lake bed, and they will do so to eat the greens that grow on the lake bottoms. The moose is a rather funny looking creature, and because of this it has earned itself a couple of different nicknames here in the state of Colorado. My personal favorite nickname for the moose is the swamp donkey. However, I have also heard them called the pine camel as well. Now, we do also get the chance to see the Rocky Mountain elk here from the train ride. Typically, the best time of year to see an elk from the train is in the months of late May into early June. We do not see any elk over the quarter of the summertime, but we do start to see a lot of elk again in late September and early October. The reason that we see the elk in these two particular times of year is due to their migratory patterns. Elk are actually very migrational animals, and they take part in some of the largest migrations in the lower 48 states. Now, I will tell you all, ladies and gentlemen, that I do a lot of wildlife photography here in the state of Colorado, and I have firsthand observed the migratory nature of these creatures. To give you an example of this, I will tell you a story of a very large bull elk that I've known for several years now, and I like to call him the Nomad. I first started seeing the Nomad about 4 years ago now. The first time I ever saw him, I found him on a riverbed at around 8,000 feet above sea level. I have a great little evening photo shoot with that bull that week. Now the following week I was in a different mountain range about 20 miles away from where I was the week before. I spotted a very large bull elk up in a sub-alpine meadow, and so I started hiking up there. Well, I made it to that meadow, and to my surprise, it was the very same bull that I had seen the week before. I discovered that he had gone some 22 miles and gained over 3,000 feet in altitude in the past week. After having followed the Nomad for several years now, I've had several experiences and can tell you that this bull elk makes this migration every single year in just one night. He makes a 22-mile migration and gains 3,500 feet altitude in about 8 hours, which is pretty impressive. I discovered this the second year I knew the Nomad. I had shot him on that same riverbed with my camera that evening, and the very next morning he greeted me in that other mountain range. It was pretty cool, to say the least. Now the Nomad is so set in his ways that he is very patternable. In which case, he actually makes that migration every single year right around July 10th, give or take a day. I can actually tell you that the Nomad is actually very likely to be migrating today, depending upon where we saw him just yesterday. And he will probably show up in that other mountain range, usually by tonight or early tomorrow morning, which is pretty cool to say the least. I will have you all know that the Nomad is one of the largest bull elk that I have ever had the chance to lay my eyes upon. For you avid outdoorsmen and sportsmen aboard our train here today, I can tell you that I was actually able to score Nomad's antlers from 2021. And on the Boone & Crockett scoring system, he came in at 406 inches of antler. Which for those of you who do not know is a very large bull elk. Now, speaking of antlers, ladies and gentlemen, antlers here in the state of Colorado are one of nature's incredible features, especially on the cervids that do grow them. Animals like bull moose, bull elk, and mule deer bucks all grow antlers. Now, a lot of folks do seem to confuse antlers and horns, but they're actually not the same thing. And I'm going to tell you why here. The first reason would be that horns are permanent upon an animal's head. Animals like bison, bighorn sheep, and mountain goats all grow horns. Furthermore, horns are made out of the same material as your fingernails, which is called keratin. Now, antlers are a little bit different, ladies and gentlemen, because antlers, for one thing, are made out of pure, solid bone, and for another thing, they're actually shed off and regrown every single year. The antler growing process for these bull elk typically begins in the springtime. Last year's set of antlers will fall off usually in the month of March, and they will start growing again in the month of April, typically. Now, to grow out the antlers are covered in a very fuzzy layer of skin. This skin covering is known as velvet. Now, the antlers are in typically from the month of April to the month of August. And the velvet is important for growing antlers. This is because the velvet supplies a blood and nutrient flow to the antlers themselves, which allows the antlers to grow. Now, while the antlers are in velvet, they're actually very soft, and these animals have to be very careful with them, or they risk severely damaging that antler. Like I said, the antlers are typically growing from the month of April, and they will usually be completely finished growing in the month of July. Now, here's the kicker about antlers, ladies and gentlemen. It's truly impressive how quickly antler can grow. In fact, a mature bull elk at the peak of his life with good genetics, good source of water, and good nutrients in his food can grow up to 2 inches of antler out of his head every single day. Pretty impressive, if you ask me. Typically, antlers do need all 3 of those variations to grow to their maximum size potential. These bulls have to have good genetics, good food sources, and a good source of water to grow a healthy and strong set of antlers. All 3 of these things combined, you can get some very large bulls walking the hills out there. In fact, when finished growing, the very largest bull elk can have up to 40 pounds of antler on top of their head. Now, after the antlers have finished growing, ladies and gentlemen, they will begin to harden underneath that velvet skin covering. This hardening process takes another 3 weeks or so, and it is due to a heightened level of testosterone in these bulls. As the days grow shorter, testosterone in these animals rises pretty significantly, and it will cause these antlers to calcify. This process takes about 3 weeks or so, and when the antlers have fully calcified, they will actually peel the velvet off of their antlers. Now, if you've never seen a bull elk doing this, it is a rather brutal-looking process, as the antlers do typically come out very bloody, and the velvet hangs off of them in large, spliced-up strips. However, these animals will continue to polish their horns against their trees and chops, and when only polishing is completed by the beginning of the elk breeding season, which is referred to as the rut season. Now, being a wildlife photographer, I will tell you that the elk rut is the absolute best time of year to view these creatures, as Colorado's backcountry does come to life with the bugling and screaming of the bull elk and the clashing of their antlers as they fight for the right to secure their genetic heritage. Now again, ladies and gentlemen, I do a lot of wildlife photography here in the state of Colorado, and I spend a lot of time with the many different animals that call this beautiful state home. So if you do have any questions about the wildlife, or you would like any wildlife viewing tips, I would be more than happy to share with you all. Furthermore, if you would like to see any of my photos, I would be more than happy to show you photography weekend just this past weekend, achieving some of my best velvet elk in business. So if you would like to see some photographs on the way back down the mountain today, please feel more than free to ask. I'd be happy to share with all of you. Along this trade line that was originally traversed by a wooden trestle, which is a bridge, for those that you don't know. Unfortunately, because trestles are tough to maintain, they actually buried all of the trestles on these mountain sides, and they would fill in the gulch and lay the tracks over the very top of them. That is actually due to a wildfire that we had right there in June of 2012. That fire actually got so close to our tracks that we had to shut down our rail operations for about 10 days while the firefighters fought the flames. Treasure Vault Mountain, or any large mountain here in the state of Colorado, you might have noticed that the trees stop growing at a certain altitude. That is actually due to something known as timberline. Now, a lot of people do seem to believe that timberline occurs due to the fact that there is not enough oxygen or carbon dioxide at those altitudes for trees to grow. But that is actually not true. Tree line is entirely dependent upon temperature. Whenever you get a year-round average temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it creates permafrost in the ground. The trees can no longer grow, creating a timberline. Timberline in the state of Colorado, ladies and gentlemen, stands right around 12,000 feet above sea level. Now, as we do round this left curve here, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to enter into one of the sharpest curves along our entire train ride today. This curve here is known as the bird's eye curve. And the fact that bird's eye curve is so sharp, you all might want to have your cameras ready, as the engine and the caboose are actually able to see one another, and you will get some great shots of Treasure Vault Mountain towering over the top of us here. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, it's kind of fun to wave to the passengers on the opposite end of the train. Be sure to wave to those folks out there as they wave back here at you. Because we cross over a four-wheel drive road in this area known as Bird's Eye Gulch Road. Bird's Eye Gulch Road is a great way to spend your afternoon up here in Leadville, Colorado if you have off-highway vehicles such as Jeeps, ATVs, Racers, things like that. Bird's Eye Gulch Road takes you from Highway 91 all the way up to the summit of Mosquito Pass, which is one of the highest drivable passes in all of North America. Now, switching gears a little bit off of the forest life and ecology of the area here, I'll go into the Leadville Railroad history a little bit more from here on out. I'm sure you all might be wondering about that a little bit. Well, the city of Leadville was an incredibly competitive place for the railroad companies of Colorado in the 1870s and 1880s. The railroads were working very hard to make their way into Leadville, as they knew that they could get rich in that city there, as it was one of the most profitable towns in the lower 48. They finished their run into Leadville on October 2nd of 1880. Now, though they were the first, they would not be the last. There was another railroad company who was a rival to the Riparian Railroad, and that railroad was known as the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad, which I will refer to as the South Park Railway from here on out. The South Park Rail Line actually built the track bed that we are currently using right here today. However, this was not their original plan to do so. Historically, the South Park did not need a rail line into Leadville because they actually had a joint operating agreement with the Rio Grande, meaning that they could use the Rio Grande's track bed to make their train ride go to Leadville. This worked out quite well for the South Park Railroad for a number of years there, but unfortunately the railroads back in the day did not get along very well. The joint operating agreement would turn quite bitter between these two railroads, and the South Park Railway would no longer have access to the city of Leadville. And so they started surveying and looking to build a rail line of their own into the city of Leadville, and that is where the birth of our railroad would come into play. Their plan was to build a 151-mile stretch of track between Denver and Leadville, Colorado. They would build from Denver to the South Park Valley, up and over Boreas Pass to the city of Breckenridge, and from there they would go from Breckenridge down the Blue River Valley into the city of Dillon, Colorado. From there, up and over Freemont Pass along these very mountainsides into the city of Leadville. At least that was their plan. Now here's the kicker, ladies and gentlemen. They had to have this rail line finished into Leadville on February 6th, 1884. They worked very diligently in about August of 1883. Just 3 years later, they had finished about 120 miles of track from Denver to Dillon, Colorado. And that meant that they had 30 miles of track to finish, ladies and gentlemen, and just 6 months to do it. That was not a lot of time, folks, and to make matters even worse, they would have to do so up here in the dead of winter, as they dealt with up to 15 feet of snow on the ground up here, and temperatures that would plummet well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Unfortunately, due to the harsh conditions at these altitudes, about 300 men would give their lives in the attempt to finish this rail line into Leadville. And that is simply because of the very hard work that they had to endure. They were up here working all on this railroad by hand. They had to lift the heavy railroad ties, which weigh about 100 to 150 pounds, and lay them on the ground. They had to move the rail lengths into place and bend the rails. And I'll have you know, one stick of narrow gauge 75-pound rail weighs about 900 pounds. They then had to spike the railroad into the ground with spike balls. It was a lot of hard work. As you can see, we were passing by some hydraulic pieces of equipment on the downhill side. These 3 pieces of equipment right here ensure that we have to do almost none of that at this point in time, as these 3 pieces of equipment do save our bodies quite a bit more. But back in the day, they did not have that luxury. But they worked very diligently, and they were flicking away up here in the dead of winter, trying to meet that deadline for February 6th, 1884. What do you all think? Do you think their hard work would pay off and they would finish this rail line into Leadville? Well, they would in fact finish this rail line into Leadville just 1 day before their deadline was due on February 6th, 1884. The Leadville, Colorado When the South Park Rail Line completed this rail line, they would call it the High Line to Leadville route. And the High Line to Leadville route was one of the most profitable railroads in the lower 48 states, as this was the shortest route from Denver to Leadville. It was 151 miles, and back in the day, that excursion by rail would take about 12 hours. Now, did you all hear me say that they called this rail line the High Line to Leadville route? Well, you might have just felt their train slowing down here, and that is because you are about to find out why they called it the High Line to Leadville. Emphasis on the high up part here. For those of you that are afraid of heights, I might recommend moving to the uphill side of the train at this time, as we are entering a section of track that we like to call the edge of the world. For those of you that may not wish to know, we will be over 500 feet off of the valley floor here, and our train tracks do come within just 3 feet of the edge. Now don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be derail the train car off the cliffs here in a time or two. For those of you who are on the uphill side, there are still some neat things for you to look at here. I think it's neat to see how the rock wall towers over the train here. And furthermore, you might notice a discoloration on the rock faces. This color that you may see on the rock faces can be orange, yellow, green, and black. This coloring that you see on these rock faces is actually a living form known as lichen. Ladies and gentlemen, I do see a deer on the very bottom of the cliffs there, right down there against the Aspen Trees. She's walking down there in the rocks. Once again, there's a deer down there way on the downhill side. But as I was sitting, those colors that you see on the rock faces here is a life form known as lichen. Lichen is a crossbreed between fungus and algae, and it does only grow on rock faces. Now, to help people remember these facts, I do enjoy telling a very lame joke. I typically tell people that the fungus and the algae got to liken one another. However, last I heard, their relationship was unfortunately on the rocks. Now, for those of you who do not mind the height, if you're reading an excellent panoramic view of the Arkansas River Valley, yes, you are looking at the Arkansas River down there on the valley floor beneath us. And you are looking at its very headwaters, as it does start a very short 5 miles up the valley from here. Now, it's pretty obvious as to why they call this rail line the High Line to Leadville, but a lot of folks do ask me why it was built way up on this mountainside as opposed to the valley floor. Well, that is because the Rio Grande Railroad had actually already built a rail line on the valley floor down there. If you look closely towards the left, there is a sharp right curve in the highway down there. Just to the left of that sharp right curve, you will see a diagonal line going across the valley floor. That is the old Rio Grande Railroad grade. Now, the Rio Grande in itself, we actually got into a few legal battles, so they were bitter with one another. The Supreme Court system ruled that the South Fork and the Rio Grande could not have a fragmented within 1,000 yards of each other. And so the South Fork was forced to build way out here on the mountainside. Now, as I said before, ladies and gentlemen, with the completion of the High Line to Leadville route, the Denver, South Fork, and Pacific Railroad would completely become one of the most profitable railroads in the lower 48 states. Governor John Evans of Colorado, he was the governor at the time here, was the president of the South Fork Railroad, and he was actually looking to retire when he built this rail line into Leadville after finishing it. And so he would in fact do so, and he sold this rail line to a railroad tycoon in the state of Colorado by the name of Jay Gould. Now here's to show how profitable this rail line would be, ladies and gentlemen. Jay Gould purchased this rail line in 1884 for $500,000. That's a lot of money in the 1880s, folks. But just 1 year later, Jay Gould was able to turn around and sell this railroad to the Union Pacific, and he did so for well over $1 billion, making quite a massive profit. This railroad would then become owned by the Union Pacific Railroad. However, it would operate under its own namesake, known as the South Park Division of the Union Pacific. It would operate as such for the next 16 years or so. But in 1898, the Union Pacific would sell this rail line to the Colorado and Southern Railroad. CNS would then be very successful in their operations on this rail line. They ran passenger and freight trains from Denver to Leadville from when they bought the line in 1898 up until the last passenger train would leave Leadville in 1937. Running simply freight trains from Climax Mine into the city of Leadville. Climax Mine was established in the early 1900s, 1901 to be exact, and it was a staple for the Leadville economy up here, especially after the silver market would crash in the late 1890s. And so Colorado and Southern would run freight trains on this line between Leadville and Climax Mine, which is the 13 miles of track that we are using right at this very minute. They would do so up until the 1950s. And in 1952, Burlington Railroad would actually purchase this rail line from the Colorado Southern. And then a few short years later, the Burlington would merge with several other railroads to create the Burlington Northern Railroad. Now, Burlington Northern Railroad is actually who we bought this rail line from back in 1987 after Climax Mine was shut down. That does have quite the fun little story to it, and I will be sure to tell you all that story here in the next mile or so.
Thank you.
Now, as we do around this left curve here, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to enter into another gulch. This next gulch is known as Big English Gulch. And here on the uphill side of the train in Big English Gulch is actually my personal favorite view from our entire train ride. I personally appreciate the layers as you look right up the view here in the middle of the gulch. You get a beautiful small mountain stream with the layers of the mountain backdrop. It's quite beautiful in my opinion. It does pass us by pretty quickly here though, so be sure to look right up the middle of the gulch as we do pass it by.
Is that the Arkansas? It feeds into the Arkansas, but there's no name to that one. That starts up by Climax, right? Yep.
Now, for those of you who are on the downhill side of there at the Big English Gulch, you might have noticed a set of wires running through the trees down there. And no, I'm not talking about the telegraph, but instead I am talking about the Top of the Rockies Zip Line Company. Coming up here, you will notice that the zip line goes directly over the top of our train. And that makes Top of the Rockies one of the only zip lines in all of North America that allows you to zip line right over a moving train. And many days during the summertime, we get zip liners that go right over the top of us.
Where are they at today? No? Very cool. Are they coming out? We'll see. Not sure.
Now, I will tell you all that they have taken to naming each and every one of their zip lines here. And the zip line that goes over the train tracks here, they like to call it the train wreck wire. And there is actually an old reason as to why. Many years ago when the zip line first started out, they needed somebody to test the zip line for them. None of the zip line employees were brave enough to do it, and so they hired a man by the name of Larry. Now, Larry was a very tall man. In fact, Larry was 7 feet 9 inches tall. Because of that, they liked to call him Larry Longlegs. Now, Larry Longlegs was testing out the zip lines. He was having a wonderful time. When he got to the zip line that goes over the train tracks there, he jumped off, but he quickly found out that that zip line had not been properly tensioned. There was too much slack on the line, meaning he would stop right in the middle, which just so happened to be over the train tracks. That day, while poor Mr. Larry Longlegs was waiting for a rescue, he unfortunately saw a steam engine coming up the valley. And that day, he would unfortunately be hit by that train. When he would lose his entire left side. They brought him down to the hospital, and when they found out that he had lost his entire left side, the doctors told him that he would be all right. A real knee slapper for you there, folks. Of course, I'm only teasing. Now, from here, you can see zipline platform number 1. That is where you would start your ziplining journey. You would then make your way across a set of 6 different zip lines at speeds of up to 45 miles an hour. And at times, you would be over 200 feet off of the ground. I've done the zip line a couple of times now. I do highly recommend it. It is a great time.
That's where the zip line is. It is, a little bit, yep. You don't. No, it's a private road. They take you up, yeah. Yeah, it's not bad at all. Couple of spots, yeah.
Now, as we round the corner here, folks, we're going to come into yet another gulch. Yep, there's a lot of gulches up here on these mountainsides. This next gulch here is known as French Gulch. And French Gulch is actually home to the French Gulch Water Tower. The French Gulch Water Tower historically was up here to service the steam engines with water, of course. Now, as we do around the corner, you all will notice that the water tower does not line up with our track bed whatsoever. That is actually due to a major accident that occurred here on June 23rd of 1980. Deceiving that this was a gravity-fed water tower, that meant that they had a reservoir up the mountainside from us. Well, that week they received record-breaking rainfalls and the dam would give way, causing a flash flood to come drifting down the gulch. It would create a huge washout right here where the tracks are. In fact, the tracks from the caboose to the railing on the downhill side would be washed away. The washout was over 70 feet across and over 50 feet deep. Now, an engineer for the Burlington Northern Railroad was on his way into Leadville from Climax Mine that morning when he saw that the tracks were gone from this area. He would hit the emergency brake on his engine, and he and his firemen would both jump off. Now, they sustained only minor cuts and bruises, but unfortunately, that engine would not stop in time, and it would crash right into the washout. This would be a very expensive mistake for the Burlington Northern Railroad. In fact, it cost them $50,000 just to get the engine out of the washout itself. After that, they would bring it down to the roundhouse in Leadville, and after draining it of its fluids such as its fuel, oil, and coolant, they were going to store it on the very end of the track bed for the time being. But unfortunately, the engineer in charge of putting that engine there, when he went to do so, did not properly couple to that locomotive. And so when he went to shove it into the end of the track, that engine would keep going, and it derailed itself right off the end of the track for the second time that week. Didn't have the best of luck with that engine there, but ultimately they would ship it off and have it repaired and restored to rail service. If any of you would like to see any photos of that engine crash, we do have some located in the boxcar right behind the register. Be sure to check those out the next time you are in there, as that crash was pretty spectacular. Ladies and gentlemen, this is rather embarrassing, but I just received word from our engineer that our train seems to have run out of fuel. Can I get any volunteers to help push us back down the mountain, please? Just kidding, guys. This is actually where we like to stop our train ride. We stop right here because we get a beautiful view of the valley from here, and it works quite well with our 2.5-hour schedule. Now, if you were to continue up the tracks from right here, there are another 3 miles of track up there, and you would come to the summit of Freemont Pass. At the summit of Freemont Pass up there sits Climax Mine, which I talked about earlier. Climax Mine was founded in 1879 by a man by the name of Charlie Center. Charlie Center staked a mining claim up there, hoping to strike it rich on gold or silver. He did not find any, but what he did find was a gray, chalky substance. Well, not knowing what this substance was, he decided to bring it to an assay office in Leadville. But they actually did not know what he had found either. It seemed he had discovered something new. Well, this new substance was totally useless to Charlie, and so he figured he would get rich and sell his mining claim, and he sold it for $30,000. Seems like a pretty good price for Charlie in the late 1800s, right, folks? Well, Charlie did make a nice little retirement with the money he made from selling the mine there, but unfortunately for him, a few short years after he had discovered that substance, a professor at the School of Mines in Colorado would identify that substance to be an element on the periodic table, which is known as molybdenum. The primary use for molybdenum is that of a steel-hardened agent, and when this was discovered, Climax Mine would open up its doors for business. When it did, they produced $30,000 an hour. Poor Charlie sold out just a little bit too cheap, I would say. Now, the mine would pick up major operation in both of the world wars as a steel hardening agent was used greatly to help with the war effort. The mine would continue to operate through the 1950s and the 1960s, employing over 3,000 men and women at those times. Now, in the 1960s, Climax Mine decided to expand itself, and to do this, they were simply going to blow it up. So they shipped 208 tons of explosives up to the mine. That is 416,000 pounds of dynamite, folks, and they set it off all at once. When they did, they created the largest non-nuclear explosion in history. This explosion was so large that you could feel it all the way down in Denver, Colorado, 100 miles away from the blast site. And in Denver, Colorado, it registered a 2.9 on the Richter scale. The mine would continue to operate through the 1970s into the early 1980s, but unfortunately, in 1986, Climax Mine would be forced to shut down. In doing so, the Burlington Northern Railroad would no longer have a use for the track bed that we are currently using today. And that means that they had two options. They could abandon this track bed, which is to tear it up and leave no trace, or they could sell it off. Well, it was back in 1987 that a local Leadville business couple by the names of Ken and Stephanie Olson said to the Burlington Northern Railroad, hey, maybe we can make a deal. And a deal they would make. Ken and his wife Stephanie purchased this rail line including 2 engines, 8 flat cars, 4 boxcars, 5 caboose, the roundhouse, thousands of railroad ties and railroad spikes, and the 14 miles of track that we own the right of way to today, all for the outrageous price of $10. You are adding a $10 trade-in.
Those videos.
So it's 35 years ago now, and Ken still likes to joke that this was the most expensive $10 he ever spent. Ken and Stephanie worked very hard over the winter months, and by Memorial Day weekend in 1988, the LCNS Railroad would open up our doors for business. We have operated every single summer since then. Would like to thank you all for joining us on our 34th season of operation here. Now at this time, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to radio my engineer and ask him to blow 2 horns out there in the valley. When conditions are right, we do get to hear 2 really cool echoes of the horn off of the valley walls. So I do ask that you all please quiet down and listen up as I radio my engineer.
Engineer, we are ready to start it. We got right. Coming up then.
Pretty cool, eh, folks? Those clouds do make for some good conditions to hear that echo there. Now, a quick footnote to Climax Mine. It did actually reopen back in 2012, and now it is the largest molybdenum mining operation on planet Earth. Climax Mine is projected to operate up until the late 2040s into the early 2050s. And the reason Climax reopened is actually because there are many additional uses for molybdenum. Molybdenum is a whitening agent, and I guarantee you it is found in your toothpaste. They use it in many different types of plastics, teeth filaments, and x-rays, and many other items as well.